Okay, we're going to begin Chumash Bamidbar. V'daber Hashem Moshe b'midbar Sinai b'ol moed. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert, b'ol moed, in the communion tent. Bechad lachodesh, on the first of the month, Hasheni, Bechad lachodesh Hasheni, the beginning of the second month. Bashana Hashenis. Again, so the Torah is saying it was the beginning, it was the first of the second month, which is the month of Iyar, Bashana Hashenis, the second year of the Tzesom, Meretz Mitzrayim Lemor. From where they had gone out of Egypt, saying, this is just a little bit of an aside. The Gemara in the Durham asks a question. I mean, something as auspicious as the Torah, as valuable. You know, very often settings indicate the value of something. To take something as invaluable as the Torah and to give it to us in such a desolate, lifeless location as the desert. The question is why? You'd think it should be the most attractive, most honorable. You know, the Gemara tells us in Yuma that if you had a vessel in the Mishkan or the Beis Hamikdash, which was made of gold, if it would become worn out and it had to be repaired, they would not repair a golden vessel. It would be replaced. Why? Because when we speak about royalty, you don't behave like a pauper. A poor man has a golden vessel, or an ordinary person, you repair it. A king, royalty, a person of great wealth, something becomes non-functional, although it could be repaired, it's replaced. So if here we're serving Hashem, nothing less than the most respectful situation we present, if we don't repair things. Here Hashem is coming to give us the Torah in the Torah, which is to him the objective and the value and the purpose of creation. You'd think he would want to give it in a location that's the most impressive, and yet he chooses a location of total desolation, desert. The reason why he chose the smallest mountain to teach us humility. Humility, to be the repository of Torah, as the Gemara tells us, just Torah is compared to water. As water flows to a lower location from a high location, the Torah can only be contained or be processed in a person who has a humble spirit. So that's the mountain. The mountain already is communicating that concept. What about the desert? The desert, something which, and especially as we discussed, the desert represents all the nether forces. The goat that was thrown down the mountainside was specifically in the desert. It was a desert location. Why? So we'd said, because that's the location of the Samach Mem, which represents all evil in existence. It was the equivalent of giving something, a gift to Satan, that he shouldn't interfere and prosecute the Jewish people on Yom Kippur. So the Gemara answers that the reason why Hashem chose the desert to give the Torah, and we incubated, the Torah incubated for 40 years. We were in the desert studying the Torah with the man, because Adam tzarach lahafker atzmo k'midbar. As a person has to make himself ownerless as a desert. As though a desert itself, there's no ownership rights in a desert, just ownerless. A person himself, when it comes to transmit Torah, a person shouldn't feel that he has any level of worthiness that to certain people he will transport the Torah, transmit the Torah, others not. Or he feels he's already communicated sufficiently and he has no obligation to continue transmitting it. He has to have a total negation to the Torah itself. As the desert has no identity, he himself, when it comes to transmission of Torah, as if he has no identity. Meaning you can never feel put upon when it comes to the teaching of Torah. The Lord tells us a story. There was an Amor, his name was Rav Preda. Rav Preda, he had a student that he was a person, years ago, there was an expression, a person that was as thick as molasses, in terms of he wasn't able to comprehend or understand simple concepts. And especially if they were more than simple, definitely he wouldn't be able to understand them. So he had a student that had an attention span which was about a nanosecond. That was his level of attention. And he taught him the Torah 400 times, the student. Rav Preda had the patience, as long as it took to somehow to get his student to understand Torah. He reviewed it 400 times. He taught it 400 times. And after 400 times, he asked the student, do you finally understand what I taught you? And he says, yes. And all of a sudden, after the 400th time, the student sees a bird flying overhead. And the student says, look at the bird. And when he said, look at the bird, that level of distraction caused him to forget what was taught to him 400 times. So the Gemara tells us, Rav Preda taught him the Torah again 400 times until finally he got it. So a bas kol had come out from heaven and said to Rav Preda, I'll give you a choice. Either you will live 400 years to correspond to the 400 times that you taught him the Torah, or I will forgive the whole generation on your behalf for all their sins. What would you prefer, to live 400 years, or the whole generation's sins should be forgiven on your behalf? Rav Preda says, I prefer you forgive the whole generation on my behalf. I don't have to live 400 years. So Hashem says, because you were so selfless, that although you could have lived 400 years and you chose that the generation should be forgiven, not only will the generation be forgiven on your behalf, you will live 400 years. So Rav Preda lived 400 years, despite the fact it was unheard of anybody in his era should live so many years. I mean, to be able to do what he did, after a while, you lose patience. You say, it's just too much. The person doesn't have the capacity. But for whatever reason, he felt that if he perseveres long enough, he'll be able to somehow communicate the Torah to him. And you can't say, people they teach, they want to pride themselves. They mentored a special person with a special mind who'll be the claim to fame in the future generation. This person over here is not going to be any claim to fame. If after 400 times you could forget it, with the least amount of distraction you could imagine. So teaching it, do you think anybody's going to look at this person? Nevertheless, he felt since ultimately he could retain it after enough transmission, he did it. What level of negation do you need for that kind of situation? It's something which is unheard of. That's about kamidbar. You have to make yourself hefke kamidbar, just as the midbar is ownerless and doesn't have any identity. When it comes to the transmission of Torah, you can't say, I've had enough in terms of who I am. I don't have to deal with this. Regardless who you are, you're no different than the desert. Therefore, the Torah itself continuously, it was given in the desert, and it incubated for 40 years. We're in the desert for that reason. It was Midbar Sinai. Bo'on Moed. Now, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh makes this point. Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai desert. So first we're speaking about the larger location. We're identifying the region. The region is Midbar Sinai. And we're in this region of Midbar Sinai, which is vast. What is the exact location? Bol Moed. The location is the communion tent. Then the Torah, when it speaks about time, the date, it's the first of the month of the second month. So we're speaking very specific. We're not speaking of the year first. First, we're identifying the time of year. The first day of the second month, Bashana Hashenis. The second year, let's say it's Meretz Mitzrayim, the second year after we left Egypt. So first we go from the larger to the detail, then we speak about more detail to the larger. It seems to be the pasuk is being inconsistent because we were speaking about first Midbar Sinai, then Ol Moed. It should continue with the same approach. The second year, which is the year, and specifically the time of that year, the first of the second month. So why do we begin with the larger, the region, then the specific location? And we speak about time, we speak about the more specific time, and then we speak about the larger period of time, which is the year itself. That's the Orach Chaim Kodesh's point, what he points out here. So he goes to explain that when we speak about vastness or innate value, factually, we're going from the lesser to the greater. Midbar Sinai, as vast as it is, compared to the Ol Moed, in terms of its innate value, it has no value. The Ol Moed is the location of the divine presence. The Shechin is there. There's Osli Migdash Shachanti B'Socham. Make for me the sanctuary, I should dwell in your midst. So we speak about, it was Midbar Sinai. Midbar Sinai is less than a speck compared to Ol Moed. That's the consistency. Midbar Sinai B'Ol Moed, the lesser to the greater. And again, Be'echad Lechodesh Hasheni, again, we're going from the lesser, the more detailed, to the larger, the first of the second month in the second year. We say that the Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin that if a person, two witnesses would come to testify regarding a capital crime case where a person would be put to death, they would explain to the witnesses that it is important for them to understand that their testimony that they're testifying has to be with such definiteness and accuracy in terms of when they witnessed it, because in fact, there's any question, any doubt regarding what they had seen, they're not permitted to testify because they're taking a life. And taking a life of a Jew is the equivalent, is the innate value is the whole world itself. Because it's, as the Mishnah says, Kol hamatzil nefesh achs miYisrael, if you save one Jewish life, it's ki'ilu hitzil olam olei. It's as if you saved the whole world. That is the innate value of one Jewish life. So we speak about it's one individual. What is the work value, the financial value of what, of one individual? It's as it's always evaluated, you put him on the slave, bring him to the slave market. What's he worth? What will people pay for him? For his intelligence, for his physical work, for his creativity, whatever it may be. But yet we still say, so we're speaking about the innate value. What is the innate value of a Jew? Innate value of the Jew is his neshama, and due that he has that spiritual component in terms of what he could accomplish. That's his innate value. So that a Jew's innate value versus the whole world, all the nations of the world, all nations of the world are not the equivalent of one Jewish soul. Therefore, when you save one Jewish person, it's like you save the world in its entirety. That's why saving a Jewish life is always an overriding factor in terms of overriding the Torah itself. It transcends the Torah itself. We'd read last week at the end of the portion of Chukosai that every Jew, it depends of the age, has a certain innate value. For instance, a person between the age of 20 and 60 has an erech. The Torah uses the term erech. Erech is not a financial value. It's a fixed amount of money. A man is worth 50 shkolim, 50 silver coins. A woman is worth 30. That's the innate value. Why it's that? Because Torah chose those numbers. A child from 30 days to 5 years to 20. The male, female above 60, the male has less of an innate value. The woman has more, but less. This was discussed at the end of the portion of the Chukosai. So it's called Erech. So the person says, I accept upon myself to give to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Mishkan, my Erech. You're obligated to give that amount of money. So there's an interesting Sefarno in Parshas Mishpatim. What is the law? If an ox gores a Jew and kills the Jew. So the Torah says you kill the ox because it killed a Jew. And then it says the owner of the ox has to pay the value of the Jew to the family. And that's considered an atonement. And what's the value? Whatever he'd be worth on the slave market, that's what he pays. But what about if the ox would gore a Canaanite slave, a male or woman? What does the owner of the ox pay to the owner of that slave who was killed? 30 shkolim. You pay 30. So the Svar over there says that what is the number 30 shkolim? He says we find by Erchim, which I mentioned at the end of Parshas B'chagosai, that there's an innate worth. When it comes to killing a slave, there's an innate worth. What's the worth? Now, a Canaanite slave, what's the Canaanite slave's obligation mitzvah-wise? A Canaanite slave is not a Noahide. It's like a semi-Jew. Male or female, a Canaanite slave has to observe all the mitzvahs that a woman has to observe, all the negative commandments and the positive commandments, which are not time determined. So the Svarda says, what is the innate value of a Eved Kenani or a Shivcha Kenanis? A maidservant who's Canaanite or the male, the innate value is the mitzvah. And by mitzvah, we find that the erech of a woman, the innate value, if you use the term erech, is 30 shkolim. So that is the way we evaluate the innate value. So the owner of the ox who killed the slave woman, male or female, both of them, because their gender doesn't determine the degree of obligation. If you're a Canaanite slave, the obligation is limited to the mitzvahs of a woman. So we're saying that that's the innate value. The Mishkan, relative to the desert, it's barely identifiable. That's how vast the desert is. But in terms of its value versus the reality of existence, the Mishkan is the old communion tent is everything. That's the location of the Shekhinah. We said in the Agoda, Baruch HaMokom Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenos Torah L'Amo Yisrael. Blessed is the Mokom, blessed is he who had given the Torah to his people Israel. So the famous Medrash always, why is Hashem referred to as Mokom? Hashem is the Mokom, he is the location. When we go to console the person who's sitting Shiva, we say, HaMokom Yenachem Eschem. The Mokom should console you. Why is Hashem referred to as Mokom? So the Midrash says that Eina Olam Mekomo Shel Mokom. The world is not God's place, but God is the place of the world. Hashem is Mekomo Shel Olam. I would just want to repeat again. Eina Olam Mekomo. The world is not his place, but who Mekomo Shel. But he is the location of the world. So we had Reb Chaim Volozhin and Nefesh Chaim explains what does that mean. What is a location? A location means it's a place that has a capacity to contain. Based on how small it is, how large it is, that's its capacity. So it means it contains whatever its capacity is to contain. What is the basis for existence? Basis for existence is because Hashem wills existence. So why does existence exist every moment in the capacity that it does function? Because God wills its function, its location, its existence. So that's the meaning. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mekomo Shel Olam. Just as the location has a capacity, and its capacity is determined by what it contains, Hashem is the Mekomo Shel Olam. God is the basis for existence, because if not for his willing it, it wouldn't exist. That's why Hashem is referred to as Mekomo Shel Olam. Baruch HaMokom. He's the location. So when we speak of the vast desert, as vast as it may be, and we speak to Ol Moed, the communion tent where the Shechin is, where the divine presence is located. It may be a 2 by nothing, it doesn't make a difference. But he himself, his location is all existence. Because he's the Mekomo Shel Olam, regardless of what the world is all about or how vast the world is. Because if he should cease willing, it should exist, nothing exists. I always say over from the Chofetz Chaim. The Chofetz Chaim says, we say, Shlomo Melech says, in Mishlei, he tells us, Ki lekach tov nosati lechem torosei atazovu. I've given you a good commodity. Lekach tov nosati lechem torosei atazovu. Don't abandon my Torah, because there's no commodity which is as good as value as the Torah itself. So the Chofetz Chaim goes to explain whose words are these. I mean, there's Shlomo's words, King Solomon's words in Proverbs, but whose words is he echoing? based on his wisdom and understanding. From what is the basis for his understanding? Because God says there's nothing more than valuable than the Torah itself. Therefore, he's telling us, don't abandon it. I've given you a gift. This gift is invaluable. There's nothing compared to it. Don't abandon it. So the Chofetz Chaim says, if you have a commoner, and he has something which he values to a great degree, he treasures it. And then you have a minister. What the commoner values versus the minister sees what the commoner values is doesn't have much value. Because if you understand what value is, it's a whole different understanding of what value is. What about what the minister values? He has certain possessions. Does it compare to what the prince has? The prince who's the son of the king? Again, it's a different level of value. Because what's available to the prince is not available even to the minister. And what's available to the king's jewels or the queen's jewels, even the prince doesn't have that level of value. What about the king's jewels, the king's treasures, the lowest echelon of angel versus the angel? What is the value of anything in the material? It has no value. Among angels, there's a hierarchy of angels. The Malochim, the Srofim, Ofanim, Chais HaKodesh, various echelons of angels. Each echelon of angel is a different dimension of spirituality. What each echelon values and understands, the echelon above it has another grasp and understanding what holiness is. Now, who's the one who's stating and quantifying the Torah? Ki lekach tov nasati lechem. Torah siyat tazovu. Hashem is saying this himself. God, that what the angel understands is meaningless. When any dimension exists, it's all meaningless. And he himself says, lekach tov nasati lechem. There's nothing more valuable, nothing better than this commodity. So, but you say it's 5 books of Moses. You know, it's 60 books. It's books. It's words printed on paper. It's all meaningless. Compared to you own a 1,000-acre estate. You own a yacht which is 6 miles long and 5 miles wide. But if Hashem says, lekach tov nasat lechem, this is what it's all about. There's nothing more precious and valuable than this. So we're speaking, you have the vast desert of Sinai, the Ol Moed. As vast as it may be, but the question is, what is the innate value? It's less than it's less than a speck versus the Ol Moed. So we're going from the lesser location, the lesser to the greater. And again, to prove this point, to emphasize this, to magnify it, we speak about the day of the month, at which month, then we speak about the year. So we're going to the lesser and then going to the greater.